It's an honor really to host His Highness Prince Faisal in this session today, and it's lovely to welcome you all to the SMENA Forum 2022. Your Highness, I know you're having a busy week in New York, and we're eager to hear some of the developments that have happened this week. Obviously, Saudi Arabia casts a long shadow on the global stage. You're one of the biggest energy producers in the world. You are one of the major economies of the world and growing fast. You're the third biggest humanitarian aid donor globally. So there's a lot that Saudi Arabia is doing, in addition to its internal transformation that is really breathtaking. Just to focus on this week, if I'm not mistaken, this morning you had a GCC +3 meeting, which follows on President Biden's visit to Jeddah to the GCC +3 in July. There were meetings on world food security during this week, on the COVID-19 global action. There was also a GCC China meeting. And as if that wasn't enough, Saudi Arabia brokered a major prisoner swap between Ukraine and Russia. So certainly a lot to talk about. Maybe to take them in pieces, perhaps we could start with the GCC +3. Where is the U.S. GCC, U.S.-Saudi relationship after the Biden visit, after this morning's meetings as well? There was a lot on the agenda, I'm sure. So what can you share with us?
Well, first, thank you, Paul, for hosting me today, and thank you for all the work that the Middle East Institute does to help understand the region and understand the relationship between the US and the region, so that's very appreciative. It was actually a GCC +4, because Yemen was also part of the meeting today, which I think was very appropriate given the situation in Yemen and the precariousness of the truce there. It was a very positive meeting, followed up, as you indicated, the Jeddah summit earlier, where President Biden and the leaders met and discussed how we can reinvigorate really the partnership between the states of the region and the United States, and find more areas to build on what has been a very successful partnership for the last decades. Obviously, regional security was also a key area of discussion, and here, one thing that was clear was a broad consensus between the US, the GCC, and the 4 other countries about the priorities, regional security, addressing those concerns, Iran, obviously Palestine, and pushing the peace process forward. But also we talked about economic cooperation, building on some of the initiatives that we had discussed in Jeddah, and of course global affairs, food security, energy security, all of these things are things that are of concern to all of us. So very positive meeting, and I think an indication that we are committed to following up on the momentum generated by the summit in Jeddah.
Fantastic. If we drill down on some of those subtopics, on the issue of energy, which has been a global issue, obviously, what were the nature of the conversations? There's been a plussing up of production since the Biden visit back in July, but then a decision by OPEC Plus to slightly reduce. What's your perspective of the energy markets going into the winter in Europe, obviously given the crises there? What would your perspective be on that?
So we see that energy prices continue to be high when we look at gas prices, but when we look at oil prices, actually they've come down significantly. They're in the 80s today. OPEC and OPEC Plus have always been committed to a price that is fair to consumers and to producers, and that's key, because in order for us to have the energy we need in the future, we need to have enough capital to invest in the infrastructure. And that's one of the risk factors we see, because while the oil markets right now are fully supplied, so there is no demand that is not being met, spare capacity is quite narrow, and one reason it is not growing is because there's not enough investment, and that's because there's not enough access to capital. The kingdom is increasing its capacity to 13 million barrels possibly by next year to do its part, but there is a constraint of capital. So right now the markets are fully supplied, but there are risks in the future. On the gas side, it's more complicated because of the difficulties in the logistics about transportation. Here, I think in our discussion, we focused on the commitment by the countries that were in the room to continue to contribute to a safe, secure, stable supply of energy in line with their capacity.
Thank you. Let me mention that this session will be about 40-45 minutes long. I will engage His Highness in a bit of a conversation, and then I'll leave the last 15-20 minutes for audience questions. So keep that in mind. Let me ask a bit about the defense relationship. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has been under numerous threats, some coming from Yemen, but overall sort of from Iran. Before getting into the Iran file itself, but on the defense relationship with the United States, which was part of the Biden visit, are there any new agreements, any progress, whether it's on sort of the bilateral or integrated air defense? What could you tell us in the defense arena?
We are, of course, exploring how we can better work together and how we can integrate our systems and how we can accelerate the capacity building to ensure that we are able to face the threats in the region. Drone technology is becoming a very significant factor in the wars of the future. We not only see it in our region, but we see it in other conflicts, and that is an opportunity for us to work together with the US and other partners to build capacity to counter those technologies, because we in the Kingdom, unfortunately, have gotten a lot of experience given the fact that Iran has supplied significant technologies of drones to the Houthis in Yemen, and we've also seen other regional actors being supplied with that technology. So we have faced literally hundreds of drone attacks over the years, and we have gained significant capacity to counter them. Something close to 94% of them are intercepted, and that is a very high success rate. And still, that is a challenge, and it's a challenge that everybody understands. And so we have actually things we can, or knowledge that we can share with our international partners to better the capacities to face those technologies.
Thank you very much. Let's switch a bit to world food security, but also Middle East food security. Obviously, the non-oil exporting countries are having a rough time in the Middle East and North Africa, let alone around the world, with the triple impacts of long-term COVID and then energy prices and now food prices. Focusing on the global food prices, global food security, Middle East food security, I know Saudi Arabia is playing a leading role. What can you tell us about the meetings this week on that issue and what Saudi Arabia is doing?
So food security is definitely front and center. It's something that has been very much part of the conversation this year. Although for us, given we are a water-poor country, it's been something that we've been dealing with for many decades, and we have been in the recent years within the framework of Vision 2030, really building a lot more capacity on how to insulate us from food shocks. But the global community needs to act collectively to address these concerns, and there are short-term immediate problems, obviously stemming from the conflict in Ukraine. And here we have the grain corridor, which is a very positive step, but we need to make sure that that continues. We need grain and other foodstuffs to flow from Ukraine and from Russia, but also something that we've been working on for the last 8 months, and we're actively actually within the G20 framework, is the issue of fertilizer. We are very concerned about the issue of fertilizer, something that has not gotten as much attention as grain supplies. And here I was heartened in the discussion today that that was actually a focus. Secretary Blinken addressed it directly, and we have been working, as I said, within the G20 to make sure that first of all, those who can increase the capacity increase it, but also that we address some of the obstacles that exist. One issue is that one of the largest suppliers of fertilizer in the world is Belarus, and they are constrained in exporting because of sanctions not related actually to the Ukraine conflict, but something more. And we've been encouraging our friends in Europe to find a way to address that, because if we don't, I have been hearing personally from my colleagues in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, that we could be facing a significant crop shortage in the coming months that would amplify the already difficult situation. And I'm happy that we've finally heard the issue of fertilizers become part of the conversation, becoming top of the conversation, because we don't have much time. If we don't get these fertilizers to the countries that need them soon, as I said, we can have significant crop losses in countries that are historically food self-sufficient. So that it was heartening, again, that was part of the discussion in the meeting today and throughout the week.
Fantastic. Obviously, Morocco as well is a big producer of fertilizer in the region. Also on the issue of agriculture and food security, climate change and rising temperatures, certainly in the Middle East, are already being felt tremendously, either in terms of very high temperatures in Kuwait or Basra, obviously parts of Saudi Arabia, but also changing rain patterns in areas which used to have pretty reliable ones. What could you describe as Saudi Arabia's effort in terms of the global sort of climate resilience plan, and were there any meetings about that this week in New York?
So definitely something that is very front and center for us, because we can see the effects directly, those that you mentioned, but also dust storms. We can see in the kingdom that the number of dust storms has increased significantly. So that, that's a clear evidence that climate change is real, that climate change is affecting everybody. We saw also the floods in Pakistan that were quite devastating, significantly impacted by climate change. So we all agree that we must address climate change. The kingdom has, as part of Vision 2030, put the environmental agenda front and center, and we are working very closely with our global allies to address those challenges for the kingdom. We have committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. We have committed to half of our electricity produced domestically being from renewable energies by 2030. We are investing very heavily in the capacity to export green energy, because one of the things we know is that much of the developed world will not be able to reach its green energy targets by domestic production. They will need to get it somewhere. And of course, we in the kingdom are blessed with a lot of space, with a lot of sunshine, also wind. So we have the capacity to produce significant quantities of renewable energy. We are committed to being the world's largest exporter of clean hydrogen. We are building significant capacity in solar energy. We are already building a grid link to Egypt. We are looking at potentially grid links through the Mediterranean to Europe and other destinations, so that we can efficiently and cheaply export green energy to the world. That's part of our contribution. We've also worked on other initiatives. The carbon circular economy, something was adopted in our presidency of the G20, which deals with the effects of hydrocarbon energy, capture, clean, reuse. Because one thing we need to understand is that we need a balanced approach. We can't just say we need a green future. We all agree we need a green future, but it's going to take time to get to that green future. And in that time, we need to make sure that there is not an economic disruption. We need to make sure that there's not an economic disruption that impacts hundreds of millions of people around the world, especially in developing countries that don't have easy access yet to renewable energy. So we need to make sure that while we build the capacity to generate renewable energy, we continue to provide the energy the world needs for its economy to go. And we can do that while protecting the environment. There are technologies that exist, and there are technologies in early stages. If we invest enough money in them, we can continue to use hydrocarbons in this interim period with minimal impact on the environment. So we're doing that. We're of course also working on efforts related to methane reduction. We joined the Global Methane Pledge. I will say that the kingdom has been at the forefront of reducing methane emissions since the 70s. So Aramco has been the global leader in capturing methane produced from hydrocarbons. So we have been committed to that for some time. So we are working in the kingdom to put our money where our mouth is, to really achieve the carbon targets, but we're also, of course, working with global partners to make sure that we are addressing it holistically, especially with those countries that can't afford to do it on their own.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, obviously, the world was already facing a number of challenges before the Russian war on Ukraine. Let me ask you, that Saudi Arabia played a very prominent role in the last prisoner exchange. Maybe tell us a bit about that, but also more importantly, does that presage a potential that maybe Saudi Arabia could play a mediating role? Obviously, the world needs an end to this Russian-Ukrainian war. President Putin heard it also from the leaders of India and China. Saudi Arabia is also very much affected. What could you tell us about the Saudi role diplomatically between Ukraine and Russia from the prisoner swap onwards?
So first, I couldn't agree more. We believe very strongly that the only way to end this conflict is through negotiation. I think everybody agrees on that. We've heard that from the US, we've heard that from Ukraine as well. Ukraine has quite clearly said that the end of this conflict will come from negotiation. So we need to find paths to dialogue. The kingdom, from the beginning of the conflict, offered its offices to mediate. The Crown Prince, really after the conflict, immediately after the outbreak of the hostilities, called both President Putin and President Zelensky to offer our assistance. Since then, we have remained engaged with all parties, and when the Crown Prince became aware of this issue of these foreign fighters and difficulties surrounding the negotiations about a business front, he engaged with all concerned parties and worked to facilitate the release of these prisoners. And I'm happy to report that they are now all on their way back to their home countries after having arrived in the kingdom 2 days ago. Again, that's just re-emphasizes the commitment to dialogue, the commitment to engagement, and if we can build on that now for a potential dialogue about an end to the conflict, that would be great. And of course, we will, the Crown Prince is going to stay engaged with President Putin, President Zelensky, and all other interested parties to that end.
Fantastic. I mean, we did mention the US GCC +4 meeting, as you said. There was also a GCC China meeting, I believe, recently. Am I mistaken about that? You've described sort of the Saudi relationship with Russia to some degree, obviously big relations with China. How would you describe that balancing act? But also perhaps maybe take my microphone because it works much better than yours.
Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah,
yes.
It's much better. But we need to hear him as well, no?
I'll be fine. It's the answers that matter. On China.
Sorry.
So the question really was about GCC China. Mm-hmm. How do you balance relations with China, obviously relations with the US? You've described a bit your situation with Russia. This great power, competition, how does GCC and Saudi Arabia see itself in the middle of all of this?
So obviously China is the kingdom's largest trading partner. It's, by the way, also the US's largest trading partner. It's also the largest trading partner for all of the GCC states, most countries in the world. So we all have an interest to be engaged with China. China is the second largest economy in the world, potentially the largest, and an active actor in the global scene. So it's important that we have a continuing dialogue. I will say on polarization, which we do see an increase in the level of polarization in the political sphere. This is causing many countries around the world, it's not just the GCC, but many countries around the world to feel that their interests are underrepresented, that their interests are not being taken care of. And this is very dangerous and it's very problematic. And if we see an increase in this polarization, we risk significant disruption to the global economy, we risk significant disruption to the global security structure, and I think it's incumbent on all of the large actors to act in a responsible manner and to address their differences through dialogue. And I will tell you that this is driving a lot of conversations among the developing world, among what I call middle powers, how we can strengthen our cooperation, how we can work closer together, how we can build an alignment that can insulate against this polarization, because none of us want to be drawn into blocks or into making choices. We all, I can speak for the kingdom, and I hear this from many of my colleagues, we have made a decision to focus on a path of sustainable development and prosperity for our people. And we don't want that to be derailed by politics. We want to talk about investment, we want to talk about innovation, we want to talk about progress, and we hope that our international partners will focus on that as well. We have historically had success in that, and I think hopefully we can, as the kingdom, the GCC, but also the global community that we engage with, can continue to send that message.
Fantastic. Let me sort of end with a round of questions about the regional geopolitics, starting with the complex question of Iran, or issue of Iran. We're at a moment we don't know if there is a return to the JCPOA or not. What are those different scenarios look like for Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has a lot of defense and security concerns. We discussed them a bit. But Saudi Arabia also is engaged in some dialogue with Iran. How do you see the next, I mean, let alone that Iran is having its own internal troubles this week, how do you see the relationship with Iran given these unpredictable scenarios in the next 6 to 12 months? What is Saudi Arabia trying to achieve vis-a-vis Iran?
So you've explained very clearly how the variables are so many that's very unpredictable. So I'm not going to start answering your question by making a prediction. What I will tell you is what we hope for. We hope for a serious engagement with our neighbors in Iran, a serious engagement that leads to understandings about the concerns of the states of the region, because it's not just the kingdom, it's all of the GCC states, it's all of the Arab states who have a concern about how we can address regional security, how we can address instability in the region that is caused by some of the actions that we see now. And you know, we want not just an engagement that leads to a reduction in tensions. We are serious about wanting an engagement that leads to cooperation, that leads to integration economically. You know, Vision 2030 is all built on a pathway to prosperity for the Saudi people, but not just for the Saudi people. We believe very strongly that Vision 2030 can be a catalyst for regional prosperity. And we see that in our integration with some of our GCC partners already, with our neighbors in Jordan and Egypt. There are a large number of projects and initiatives that feed off of what we're doing in Vision 2030. And that can be also the case with Iran. Iran has a lot of potential, but the only way it's going to unlock that potential is if it focuses on what can deliver prosperity for the Iranian people, rather than some ideological prospect of regional influence or whatever. So we are focused on the prosperity of the Saudi people and people of the region, and we hope that the Iranians will join that pathway, and that can then be a pathway to security stability. So that's what we hope for. What will happen, I can't predict.
The talks are happening with the mediation of Iraq. Iraq is sort of I don't want to call it a test case, but it's an important area where both Iran and Saudi Arabia have, let's say, you know, an interest and a presence and so on. But Iraq itself is going through a very acute crisis. How does Saudi Arabia look at that sort of crisis in Iraq? What is it trying? How is it trying to move the situation forward in that country?
Okay, we have been, you know, engaged in Iraq for the last few years to really increase the integration of Iraq into its Arab neighborhood. Again, the same concept that I just talked about, prosperity, a pathway to prosperity. So we are working with Iraq to integrate their electric grid into the GCC. We are working to integrate their transportation networks into the GCC. We are encouraging Saudi businesses to invest in Iraq, to bring factories, to bring programs and projects into Iraq, because if Iraq and the people of Iraq have hope, if they see a pathway to a future that is prosperous, that delivers jobs, that delivers opportunity, I think that will lead to a stabilization of the situation in Iraq, and it will marginalize those actors that, again, not focused on what delivers for the Iraqi people, but more focused on regional agendas or narrow political or ideological agendas. And if we can do that, Iraq can become a critically important catalyst for regional success. You know, Iraq is a large country with a substantial resource base, with a substantial population that is well educated, hardworking. So they have all the building blocks of becoming a regional powerhouse. And from the kingdom's perspective, that would be a very important addition to the prosperity of the region, because you know, when one of our neighbors is successful, that means we have more opportunities to trade, we have more opportunities to work together, we have less risks of security issues, and that then feeds into our own path to prosperity. So that's really what we hope, and that's the engagement that we've had. We know the situation right now is difficult, but there are voices in Iraq that are calling for exactly that, that are calling for a change in direction, for a focus on the interests of Iraq and building Iraq's economy. And, you know, if they pull together, they can do it. Iraq has a lot of potential.
On the southern side, on the issue of Yemen, which has been a bleeding wound for a number of years, a serious humanitarian crisis, but also a lot of loss of life in the civil war, threats to the kingdom from the Houthis and so on. Luckily, there's been a truce. Hopefully, that will be extended. Do you see, a positive pathway for Yemen to at least extend the truce, but also move towards resolution? And how does the kingdom see itself in that crisis?
So I see the path. The path is an extension of the current truce and then working towards a permanent ceasefire in line with the proposal that we've put on the table March last year, and then political dialogue among the Yemeni parties to agree on what the future of Yemen will be. The GCC hosted a few months ago an inter-Yemeni dialogue with all parties present except the Houthis, although they were invited, but they chose not to be part of that dialogue. And so we have a pathway to a better Yemen. Unfortunately, right now, the indications are that the Houthis don't believe in that pathway. So we can see signs that they are not likely to agree to an extension of the truce. That would be a very unfortunate development because this truce has already delivered for the Yemeni people. It, of course, has stopped the fighting, but it's also allowed the government of Yemen to work on better delivering services to the areas where it controls. It has allowed for better access to goods and services to the Yemeni people. It's also improved the finances in Yemen, including the Yemeni currency being supported. And, of course, all of that is risked by a return to fighting. Therefore, I would say if the Houthis are truly interested in what's best for Yemen, what's best for the Yemeni people, they will agree to extend the truce, and they will then work towards a permanent ceasefire. Right now, we see that they are putting forward endless demands that they know very well the government of Yemen can't meet, while at the same time not having fulfilled the commitments they made under the current truce agreement. So they are not doing what they're supposed to, and then asking more from the other parties. And we also see significant mobilization of their military forces, re-equipping, including continuing to receive a steady flow of arms from Iran. The signs are not positive. We will continue to work, we will continue to push, we will continue to engage to try to make it happen. And here, of course, we need the international community also to have a very unified voice to say, look, the only answer is peace, the only answer is staying the course with a truce and then working to improve that. And if any party decides that war and conflict is their choice, that the international community will call them out, will stand against them, and will take appropriate action to prevent them from succeeding in that endeavor.
Thank you very much. It happens that today in our headquarters in Washington, we're hosting the Yemeni president and Tim Lenderking, the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen, the Yemeni ambassador. So we're also very keenly engaged there. I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions, and then I'm going to turn it to the audience. So if you have questions in mind, please prepare them. I wanted to ask about both Israel and Palestine. Maybe let's start with the Palestinians first. Separate from the Israel-Palestine, one day return to some process. But how is the kingdom engaging with the Palestinians, whether it's on the West Bank or on Gaza, or if not? How does the kingdom see its abilities to shore up the Palestinian situation?
Well, you know that we've always been steadfast in the support for the Palestinian people, and we have continued to support Palestine and its right to a state, its right to self-determination, its right to not just self-determination, but dignity. And what we all need to focus on is a pathway of hope and dignity for the Palestinian people. Without that, we will not have stability, and that can only be achieved through a peace settlement in line with the Arab Peace Initiative. We had a side event here a couple of days ago to discuss the prospects of a peace, of renewed efforts for peace. We focused on the fact that it's been 20 years since the kingdom launched the Arab Peace Initiative, and it was adopted by the Arab League and then also the OIC. And so there has been a viable deal on the table for some time. We now need to engage. We heard some comments yesterday that might indicate some positive momentum in that direction. I hope that translates into concrete action, and we will continue to support, as I said, the Palestinian people and their rights to a better future. And we hear the international community committed to the same, but we do need more action on that file.
Indeed, I think Prime Minister Lipid mentioned for the first time in a few years, Israeli Prime Minister mentioning the two-state solution again. And that gets me to the question about Israel itself. Obviously, a lot of countries embarked on the Abraham Accords process. That has its own dynamic. Maybe a double question. One is, how does the kingdom view the process of those countries that did the Abraham Accords so far? Is it, how comfortable is it with all of those things? And obviously the question that everybody asks, is Saudi Arabia potentially, is it interested? If so, what would be the pathway? Obviously, Israeli-Palestinian issue is key. Would there be anything else? In Biden's visit in July, there was a lifting of restriction of civilian overflight rules in Israel, but really not much else. What can you say about that sort of combination of issues relating to Israel?
So we're definitely interested, and we've shown our interest with the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative was predicated on, full normalization with Israel. Even before that, the Fez Initiative of 1982, which was also a Saudi initiative by the late King Fahd, also indicated the desire for normalization. The only pathway to a stable region is a resolution to the issue of Palestine, and that will only be resolved through a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital in the parameters that have been set forth. We need negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis to move to that direction, and we will support any efforts in that regard. Until that happens, any further steps will not be sustainable. So we need sustainable peace, and only the way to sustainable peace is through finding a resolution.
Thank you. Let me turn to the audience. There will be mics. Let me start with Raghida. I know everybody knows who you are, but to set a precedent, say who you are and your question.
Yes, good morning. Your Royal Highness, it's good to see you again, since Berlin, actually. And Paul, thank you for your line of questioning. I need to follow up on a couple of points with your permission. I'm Raghida Dargham. I am the founder and executive chairman of Beirut Institute and a columnist with the National and the Nahar al-Arabi. We have heard from the Iraqi foreign minister that you are thinking of another round of negotiations or talks with Iran coming up soon. The fifth one was already concluded, I believe, and he spoke of a different level. Can you address what level are you thinking about? Can you share with us what regional issues are you putting on the table of discussion? I'm sure Paul wanted to mention Lebanon and didn't get the chance to do so. So like a country like Lebanon, is it part of a discussion or does Lebanon not matter to Saudi Arabia anymore? You could tell me that. And on the security issue, Mr. Minister, you spoke of the security structure. You and Iran have completely different take on the security structure for the region. How are you addressing this? And do you believe Iran has now become nuclear and that you have to live with it, with a new thinking of a security structure? Thank you.
Thank you, Raghida.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghida. And we still care about Lebanon. I want to just make that clear. I won't go into the details of the discussions because they are still private, and it would not be helpful to bring the nature of the discussions in public. We are looking at the sixth round. We are discussing with our friends in Iraq if that is viable, when it should be. We have not yet decided, any of us, at what level it should be. We're still considering that, and when we make the decision, it will be something that we tell everybody. Yeah, I mean, we are obviously concerned about the nuclear program. We have made quite clear that a nuclear-armed Iran will be an incredibly dangerous thing. It will be significantly destabilizing not just to regional security, but the global security structure. We understand that JCPOA was a pathway to address it. We always felt that JCPOA was flawed. And now we are hearing even a return to JCPOA is not possible. So this, of course, is then a significant concern. we hear from the Iranians that they have no ill intent in their nuclear program, that their nuclear program is purely for civilian use. I hope this is true. If it is true, then I don't see why full transparency on the program would be a problem. I don't see why the IAEA probe would be a problem. I don't see why engagement with both international organizations and the regional countries on that program would be a problem. We have plans for a nuclear program as well, and we have made quite public that we will be adhering to the highest standards of transparency, that we are open to working with our international partners to build that program so that everybody has full visibility into it. So we are cognizant of Iran's desire to have a civilian nuclear energy program. We understand the benefits of that. We don't understand why there should be any lack of transparency around that program, why there should be any resistance to having every aspect of that program open to the world, open to the neighbors. So I hope that the Iranians will take a path of transparency to give everybody comfort. If they don't, that will leave questions on the table for all of us about the ongoing intent, not just past intent.
Thank you. Questions? Gentleman in the back, third row. Yes, sir.
Alain Dargham from MTV Lebanon. I want to talk about Lebanon again, and thank you for caring about Lebanon, Your Highness. So basically, the last meeting between Saudi Arabia and French and United States, you advised the political class to come up with a president, not confrontational. It could probably save Lebanon from its crisis. So let's say, for example, and you know very well that Hezbollah still control so much in our government. Let's say he pushes for president is not the qualification that you're looking for. What's going to happen here between the relationship between Lebanon and Saudi Arabia?
Thank you, Alan.
So I'm not going to react to hypotheticals, but what I will say is that it is up to the people of Lebanon, to the political leaders in Lebanon, to choose their path. I think we've all seen that the current path is not working. The current path is not delivering. You know, I talked in the beginning about building sustainable prosperity for your people. So do the leaders in Lebanon, do the people in Lebanon want the pathway to sustainable prosperity? Lebanon has tremendous potential. It could be, as it was once, the jewel of the region. All that needs is sincere leadership and action. It's up to the Lebanese to decide if they want that path. We can't decide that for them. We can only help them if they decide to take that path.
Thank you very much. Questions in the front here? Yes, sir.
Your Royal Highness, I'm Jahangir Khan. I'm the director of the United Nations.
Microphone close to your mouth. That's all.
Your Royal Highness, I'm Jahangir Khan. I'm the director of the United Nations Counterterrorism Center, which has been generously funded by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And my question is related to the role of the Kingdom in the United Nations. The Kingdom was a founding member of the United Nations. It's a very active member. It has generously supported humanitarian causes, and indeed, even in our area of peace and security and counterterrorism, for example, it's the leading country. So I'm curious to ask you, Your Royal Highness, how do you see the role of the Kingdom today in a very polarized world, as you explained earlier on, and in particular the role of the United Nations? And what can the Kingdom do to further strengthen multilateralism in the context of the United Nations?
Thank you very much. It's an important question. And the issue of polarization is really becoming dangerous. And it's something that is part of the conversation among all of us who work in diplomacy, because we see that we are on a pathway that will significantly impact all of our security and all of our economic interests. So we are working very hard in the Kingdom. We are a member of the G20. We are the largest economy in the Middle East. We are nonetheless still a developing nation. So we have a responsibility, of course, to be a voice for all of the developed world in these large fora. And we are trying to send a message to all of the players on the global scene that polarization, confrontation is in nobody's interest. We must seek to resolve our differences through dialogue, through engagement. And we are in the Kingdom actively trying to help facilitate those engagements. An example was, of course, this recent prisoner swap, but that's just one area where we are engaged. We can't publicly talk about all of them, but we need to have a voice for the majority of the world. You know, we have the developing world is on a very, very difficult position right now. It is we had COVID and the challenges of COVID. We were barely starting to build ourselves out of that, and then we got hit by the effects of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis and the food crisis and all of these things. And at the same time, you know, we have this polarization, which is, I think, skewing the conversation rather than addressing how we can address these problems in a way that serves everybody's interests. Everybody's going into their corner. And I think that it certainly doesn't serve the people of the Middle East. It doesn't serve many of those countries that are involved. So we will continue to put that conversation forward.
Thank you. I do want to recognize with us today Her Excellency Rani Al-Mashat, distinguished minister in the government of Egypt, helping lead the transformation of Egypt economically. And I do want to make sure, Your Highness, that we address how Saudi Arabia, its partnership with Egypt. Egypt is obviously the biggest critical country in the region. A few words about Saudi Arabia's Egypt policy, and then I'll return to some questions.
I mean, Egypt, of course, is historically key partner for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we've always had a very, very close relationship, and that relationship is even closer now. And we are working on significant economic initiatives. Again, it's all about prosperity, and I have to say President Sisi has been doing a fantastic job of focusing the government in Egypt on reform, on the economy, on real change that will deliver a re-energized Egyptian economy. And we've seen signs of that. Of course, there have been challenges, again, with food security and, the rise in prices, where we've helped when we can. But where we are most engaged is investment. We are investing heavily in the Egyptian economy because we believe in the future of Egypt. We are working to integrate our economies as well. So we're building, I think I mentioned, we're building this electricity link into Egypt so that we can export cheap energy into Egypt. We are doing many, many initiatives. And of course, we also have a very strong political coordination that is very effective, very important in trying to handle the challenges that the region faces. So the Saudi-Egyptian partnership is one of the keys to regional stability.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left. So just two questions, one from the right wing, one from the left wing. So let's start quick questions. Please, yeah.
Left wing.
From
on this side of the room.
From
anyway.
here, it
Thank
looks...
you. Thank you. Thank you, Elise Labit, Your Highness. Very nice to see you again. I'd like to bring you back to something and follow up on your previous remarks. You've said many times that you're worried about blocks and the political polarization. And I'm wondering if that presents an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to do more of, obviously we saw what happened with Russia, and that was good news, but to do more of this brokering between these, what clearly seems to be two axes going on right now. I think there's a lot of concern about that happening. And how does Saudi Arabia position itself for the inevitable divisions that are continuing to further? Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. And one question, lady in the third row. Sorry, I can't get everybody. Stand up so the mic can come to you. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Aya Batrawi with the Associated Press. In 2018, the kingdom took a severe hit internationally over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And while a lot of time has passed, and I know that verdicts were handed and the case has been closed from the Turkish side, we've seen in recent weeks terrifyingly long prison terms given to women who simply retweeted potential criticism of the government. And I'm just wondering, as Foreign Minister, how you square that with all the tremendous progress that's been taking place in other parts of the country.
Thank you. No question about the blocks?
Yeah. So I think it's very important that we remain engaged, as Liz mentioned. It's very important that we work with our international partners, especially the big players, to understand the concerns of the developing world, to understand the opportunities that exist, but also the dangers that this polarization poses. And of course, we are always engaged. The kingdom, is a member of the G20, is a key player in the global economy, is a key economic partner for almost all of the countries in the world, of all the big economies in the world, we are obviously a significant player in the energy markets, but well beyond that as well. The developments within Vision 2030 offer tremendous opportunities as well for economic cooperation with these countries. So there's a lot we have to offer, and that means that we have the opportunity also to convene, to engage, to discuss. The Kingdom's leadership is very focused on that. The Crown Prince makes it a key part of all of his discussions with world leaders when they visit and when he engages with them to talk about the concerns, not just about Saudi Arabia, but about the rest of the world, and to try and find avenues to address the challenges that we have around the world in a way that considers everybody's interests, and that is sustainable, that is not just about scoring points. So it's a key focus for the Crown Prince personally, it's a key focus for our foreign policy to try to be a facilitator of dialogue, a facilitator of understanding. So that's for us key. On the second question, I will say that those cases are still in process, so they are not yet in the final appeal, and therefore I prefer not to comment on them at this time, and given that we have an independent judiciary, and until that process is finished, I prefer not to comment.
Well, I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions, but His Highness's time is limited. I know you have a lot of engagement still in New York. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today and to share your perspective on Saudi Arabia's foreign policy, and for joining us in this MENA forum along with Think Advisory. So good luck with your efforts with the remainder of your stay. And please join me in thanking His Highness.
Thank you very much. Thank you.